Today, we're here with David Toyer, who does land use and economic development consultant. He is the owner and founder of Toyer Strategic Consulting. We're going to talk about land development. We're going to talk about why housing is so unaffordable and what you don't actually know about land development and what you think that's actually wrong. David, thanks for hanging out with me. You're a land use and economic consultant. I want to talk about what you do, how you do it, and what we see is the good, the bad, the problems in land development right now.
Absolutely.
Tell us about who you are and what you do.
Well, I founded a company called Toyer Strategic Advisors. As you said, we're a land use and economic development consultancy. Our primary focus is helping builders, developers, organizations, individuals, communities, small businesses with creating jobs and housing. And that entails a lot of different things. We touch a lot of different areas. But really what we bring to the equation is not so much like we're not surveyors, we're not engineers, and we're not like land use council. What we understand is the processes and the politics and the procedures and understand the people part of it. And we really help kind of bring all of those elements together to try to make projects more successful.
What areas do you serve?
So we're primarily serving Washington State.
Yeah.
Now, during COVID, pre-COVID, we were actually really just like King, Snohomish. Occasionally we'd drop into one of the other counties in the surrounding area. The thing that happened with COVID was when a lot of businesses were struggling, and we did for a little while, jurisdictions had to switch to hybrid models of doing business because their councils had to meet hybrid. They had to allow for public comment hybrid. There was all those things that changed. What that gave us the opportunity to do was to take on some of our clients' work. We call them legacy clients. Clients have been with us for a long time, but we were able to take on work for those clients and work in other areas. And it was now cost effective for us to provide those services because we don't have to, like every time there's a meeting, a hearing or whatever, we don't have to go a long distance to get there. We can attend, via all these nice hybrid opportunities these days.
I love it. You are a land use and economic development consultant. Like what does that mean?
So there's a funny story I like to tell because it's a hard one to describe. Like what is it you guys do? Yeah. And you can go to our website, toyerstrategic.com. There's all kinds of fun stuff where we try to describe what it is that we do. But back when I was starting the company in 2016, we were at a friend's house. My wife and I were visiting a couple of our friends. And one of them, I could hear this from the other room. One of them asked my wife, so what is he doing? Yeah. And my wife paused for this awkwardly long period of time as she's trying to process in her head, what is my husband doing? And basically what she came back is she goes, I don't know. He's kind of like a fixer.
Yeah.
That was her way of explaining it. And so, I ultimately had to follow that up with, clearing, it up and providing some more context and information. But what we really do is we help companies evaluate what their opportunities and challenges may be.
Yeah.
And then work through those. And so that may be a rezone. We may have a client that comes to us and says, hey, they got this beautiful piece of property. It's currently zoned residential, but it's in an area where there's commercial needs. And I would like to build a commercial project here. Can you help me out? And we'll look at it and see, can we rezone this? Sometimes it's, I got this beautiful piece of property. It's residential. I'd like it to be multifamily residential instead of low density single family residential. Is there a way to make that happen?
Yeah.
And we look at that. We get small businesses that come to us, and their concerns are innumerable. We could talk about some of those as we kind of get into this when we get to talking about challenges and stuff. But small businesses sometimes have a really difficult time navigating. I go to my attorney and they help me set up my business, and I talk to my accountant and they help me set up how I track the finances. But neither of those folks know anything about zoning and permitting and occupancy permits and all those sorts of things. And we do. And so you would be surprised, the various issues that businesses will come into because they are not in the right zone, or they think they're a home-based business, but technically they're not a home-based business. And so we help them work through things either on the front end, which is ideally when to do it, before they've made decisions to spend money and obligate themselves to contracts,
Or
But
before they get the code violation.
before they get the code violation, yes. And that's the other thing. What we end up doing is when they get the code violation, we help them out. And we've had a good track record of doing so. The problem is that, there are instances in life where you say it's better to ask for forgiveness and permission. When it comes to land use and potential code violations, it is never better to ask for forgiveness. It is always easier and less costly to ask for the permission up front and to make decisions accordingly. A typical code violation these days, if there's an ability for us to work through a solution other than them shutting their doors, oftentimes it's going to take a year or more.
Wow.
And it can cost thousands and thousands of dollars. You not only are paying for our time, you're paying for permit fees, you're paying for studies and reviews and site plans and traffic data and all of those things that you would do for a development as if you were new construction. There's elements of that you have to do then as a part of solving a code violation. And it's cruel and it's brutal. And for these small business owners, developers are used to cutting checks for things like that, right? It's a part of the game. But for a small business that is not used to that, it's a very stressful and painful time.
Absolutely. Basically, and we've talked about this before, if you're going to be a developer, you're just going to put money in the center of the table and light it on fire. And so when you go to a small business owner and you say, hey, by the way, we're going to put money in the middle of the table and light it on fire, they're like, what?
Yeah.
The developer's kind of conditioned to that. I want to move into our next thought here is, why has housing become so unaffordable from your perspective? Like, what's really affecting us here that you would say the general public doesn't know and doesn't understand?
Sure. I think to put that into context, and some people get this, especially people that move here from somewhere else because they've taken a new job or whatever. I spent a little time in Iowa. Before starting this company. We'd spent a few years in Iowa after the 2008 recession and the housing market blowing up. I had to go somewhere else and find something else to do because it was just frustrating to be out here. The house that we had in Iowa was on a quarter acre. It was about the same size as the house we have today here in Washington. That is on a 3,700 square foot lot. Substantially different, right? Depending on how well you trust some of those little marketing things that the realtors send out about what your house is worth at any given point in time, it's worth, right now they say somewhere around $850-ish, $860-ish. That house, $230,000 in Iowa.
Yeah, massively different.
Massive difference. Now the wages are lower in Iowa, cost of living's lower in a lot of ways in Iowa, so that makes up for part of it, right? But why is real estate so different in value? And you could say it's supply and demand. And I agree with you. Those places aren't growing at the same levels of population growth that we are. But at the end of the day, there's a couple of factors I think that are really driving costs here and why housing has gotten so unaffordable. The first of those is we have a constrained land supply. About 30 plus years ago, more than that now, Growth Management Act was adopted by the state legislature. And prior to that, communities planned, but they didn't always coordinate their planning. And planning for certain elements of land use was not always coordinated or thought of relative to planning for things like infrastructure and what that would cost and who would provide it and those sorts of things. So they adopted the Growth Management Act. Yep. And the Growth Management Act, in that process, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I want to answer your question first. One of the main requirements is identify your areas where your urban growth is going to be, and that's where your urban growth is going to be. And by urban, that means, anything of significant density, your commercial development, your industrial development, and you're really looking at the mandate is, right now, most people assume it's like 90% or more of all of your growth needs to go in these urban areas. What's happened over time is those boundaries haven't changed.
Yeah.
So those boundaries were set in the Puget Sound region in 1995.
Wow.
And albeit a few things here and there along the way, because there have been some minor adjustments and some changes. And one of the ways that it was changed was transfer of development rights. Some areas were permanently preserved. Development rights were taken from those areas and UGAs were expanded. And so it really wasn't necessarily adding new, it was shifting stuff from rural to urban by making an expansion. But at the end of the day, when you say we're going to take 90% of growth, we're going to put it in urban areas, or 95% of growth, which is really what they're striving for now, and we're going to put it in the urban areas, that looked substantially different in 1995 based on the population projections at that time than it does today in 2024, right? We have
think?
massively increased in size. And so the competition for land is incredible.
Yes. Astronomical.
And it's not just developers that are competing for the land. So you have developers that are trying to buy the land. You have cities that are trying to buy the land for parks, trying to buy the land for public buildings. You have school districts trying to buy the land for new schools. Everybody's competing. And when you have competition like that, prices go up. When you have a scarcity of a product, prices go up. And then with that, land seller expectations. So I remember when I started doing some of this work, I started out in the Master Builders Association in 2000. A couple of years later, I went and worked for a company called Barclays North. It was a huge land developer at that time. I would say back then in the early 2000s, 20 years ago, most people didn't have a good sense of what their property may be worth. They would throw out a crazy number, but like they know, like, you know, my house, it's listed, it could list for maybe 850, 860, whatever. They would look at my house. They're like, dude, if that house on that 3,000 square foot lot is going for $800,000, then my piece of junk house that was built in 1954 on a 5-acre tract has got to be worth like, I don't know, $7 million.
Yes.
Right? So the land seller expectation, because of what they see in the marketplace, has changed substantially. And what they're not looking at when they're throwing out a number or they're creating the expectation for what they want is, what's it going to cost that builder to develop that property? And by develop, I mean permitting it through the process and then actually constructing it and financing all of that along the way and ending up at a unit. And when you get there, like, you have to start is what can I sell this unit for? And then, you know, you have to back all of these things out. And then you come up with a number of what you can pay for the land.
Yeah.
You know, that's the working assumption of what you can pay for the land. And you have to have some safety factor in there, because when you look at all of the things that can go wrong in the process, which I'm happy to discuss, at the end of the day, like, you know, I compare it, like you're like a guy sitting at a Texas Hold'em table or a gal sitting at a Texas Hold'em table. You're taking a calculated risk based off of like the analytics of, if it's this combination of cards and this is what's on the table, that's what it looks like. But your percentages, like you see on the shows, you know, the percentages when you have the cards and who's got what and everything are changing all the time. Well, that's like interest rates are changing, right? So that's changing your odds of, are you going to be successful with this? There's all these things that are adjusting all the time, and that has a big influence. And so, you know, if you take the risk, you got to have a reward at the end of the day, and you got to have kind of enough pad there to protect against things going wrong, because things will go wrong.
So let's break that down real quick. Give me your rough developer math. So I start with the finished product of the house minus.
Well, I mean, we could go through this math thing. There are so many minuses that have to come off the top. It's incredible. But let's try to keep it as simple as possible. You have what your sales price is.
Yep.
You have basically then all the costs that go into that. And so typically, let's kind of start in the middle. Typically what you have your land cost up front.
Yep.
Developer has to sit down, put a pro forma together, and they go, okay, this is the cost of the land. This is the cost of all of the entitlement work, is what we call it. So cost of the permits, cost of the consultants to prepare the permits, and all of the reports and the studies and the plans and everything else. And so you have what we call the you know, it's an entitled price. So you got an entitled price. It's what a builder might be willing to buy entitled lots from you for. And that's one number. And then you've got another number out there, which is, now I've gone past entitlements, and as a developer, I've spent the money to actually construct it. Now I have finished lots. And then there's a finished lot value. At either jump off point, whether it's the entitled value or the finished lot value, wherever the builder picks that up, they've got, you know, the developer needs to make their margin, the builder needs to make their margin, and both need to account for whatever risk it is in the process, where they are at in the process and how much risk is left, they have to account for that. And so those are the kinds of things. So you look at that final home price, that is, the builder getting their, profit. That is that construction costs. So that's roads, stormwater, landscaping, the house. I mean, the whole shebang. And then you dig deeper into that, and that's the hundreds of thousands of dollars you're going to spend on your consultants to get a permit and everything else. I mean, it's a lot. And then a couple of the other factors that also hurt this affordability in our region is we've seen very volatile, and this is not just a COVID thing. We've seen more of it with COVID, post-COVID, during COVID and post-COVID than we probably did pre-COVID, but there's always something that's in the marketplace that's unstable, whether it's lumber prices or it's asphalt costs.
Yes.
Lumber prices, it's because of tariffs. Asphalt prices, it's because a refinery is down, or some place in the world, oil's got a problem, in the supply chain. But construction material costs are always changing. In some respects, when you have scarcity in that and the market's changing, and you're asked to order the stuff earlier and earlier, and you're willing to pay a premium to order it to make sure that it gets there on time, that has a substantial impact on the final product. Regulations and the changes that are going on in regulations, every time they update the stormwater manual for Western Washington, the detention vaults have to get bigger. Well, that's a cost, right? Yeah. It's a substantially higher cost. And then I think the other thing, and you're probably very well versed in this, much more so than I am, because I'm a code nerd, right? But the financing piece of this is huge.
Huge.
And that's interest rates. That's not only interest rates for the end buyer, that's the interest and returns that a developer or builder have to pay whomever they're borrowing their money from.
Yep.
Because most of them out there aren't writing, they're not paying in cash.
Yep.
Okay. So when you think about financing costs, you're either getting a bank loan or you're getting equity financing or you're getting debt financing, or in the case of some, you're trying to structure a deal with all of those because, the bank's only going to give you so much loan to value.
Bingo.
And they're going to have their percentage rate. And then you go get an equity partner, and they're going to have a rate of return that their expectation is going to be higher than the bank's.
Yep.
Or even a debt, partner that's coming in. Again, they're also going to have kind of similar requirements and or higher. And you have to layer all those things into what you're doing. And that's what makes this expensive.
What are common misconceptions about land development, the land development process?
That's an awesome question. And I'm glad you asked that. Because
I like how you just start laughing.
Well, it's just, because just of the stuff we see sometimes, and I guess you call it somewhat the horror stories we see.
Yeah.
Whether they're ones that we work on as a company and help fix or try to fix.
Yeah.
But I've seen some stuff over the years, even pre-2008, people that when the market's great, everybody wants to be a developer, right? Yeah. When the market's great, everybody wants to flip homes. And the perception is, the most part, the TV stuff that you see and everything else is everybody's making money hand over fist. The reality is that's not the case. Yeah. Even in an up market, there are folks out there that can get burned and burned badly, and that's something that has to be considered. So the thing that I would say is that the biggest misconception I see a lot of times from most people is, I'll give you the first one first and the one that takes a little more time to answer. The first major misconception out there is developers and builders are greedy and everything's overpriced because of them. And that's not the case. They're working from inputs, right? So they're usually trying to achieve a standard return on investment, and everything else that goes into the final price, they're trying to achieve a percentage return on investment at the end of the day for the risk that they've taken and the money they've put up. All of the stuff that drive that price are all the inputs along the way. It's not what they're making.
What are those inputs?
Like we talked about, right? It's the permitting, it's the consultant fees, it's the impact fees, the connection charges for utilities, it's the construction cost of the project, it's all of those costs. It's the money you got to pay the bank for the privilege of taking on the risk and doing all the hard work. All of those things. It's the money you got to spend, you're putting in a project. You got to go get an easement from John and Sally, and John and Sally want $10,000 for you to be able to get a water line easement to run the water line through their backyard. I mean, it's all of those things that go, the inputs along the way that drive that price. The developer's just looking to get their return on investment back. And it's usually standard what they're looking for. They have pro formas, and they're like, I got to at least get this out of this. If I get more than that, that's great, but I've got to at least get this out of this.
What would be the standard number that you see they're trying to achieve?
I hear it all across. It's very, and honestly, at the end of the day, I don't know if anybody's ever, truly given me their number.
Yeah.
Right. Because in some respects, it's a
trade secret.
It's a trade secret. It's a competitive aspect of what they do, and they like to protect it. Like, ask a builder, hey, what's a lot worth?
Yeah.
In this jurisdiction? The builder is going to think about that long and hard, because, like, do I want to give out a number that gives away my strategy here?
Yeah.
Or like, what are you willing to pay for raw dirt by acre? Well, and they'll give you like 8 or 9 bullet points of all of these things that influence their decision making. So it's really hard to peg down specific numbers. It's kind of proprietary. But anyways, so back to you said, big misconceptions. I would say one of the biggest is that it's easy and anybody can do it. Ooh. Or anybody can be a developer, and it's not easy. I mean, it is a meat grinder. I don't know any other way to explain it. It's a meat grinder.
Well
it
said.
Is going to turn you around, flip you upside down, squeeze you, poke you, pinch you. And at the end of the day, you just hope to get out of it with something left. I mean, that's really what it feels like for most people, even the folks that have been doing this a long time. And I'll use my poker analogy again. If you ever watched the World Series of Poker on TV, and, like, I used to think, like, wow, man, that's pretty incredible. I don't think I could do that. That's just like, to push all in on the table, and, you're hoping the cards flip out right. And I'll tell you the reason why I say that is because I got invited to play at this little poker game once. It was called like the Washington Poker Tour or something like that. There's a bunch of guys that would organize these events. I remember one time it was the only time I went, and I had this great hand. I had 2 jacks, and at the end of the time I had quad jacks.
Oh my.
And I thought I was like, golden. Yeah, well, it turns out somebody else had quad queens. So I pushed in all in with my quad jack, and I got ripped by quad queens. What are the odds? They're it's like one of those bad beat kind of things, I'm sure. That was my lesson in kind of poker and gambling, and that was enough of a lesson for me to know, okay, this is my game. But if you look at, let's break down development and think of it like a kind of the layers of Texas Hold'em, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
So the first thing you got is you're reading the table, right? You're sitting down at the table, you're seeing the guys that are, around you. And for the land development side of things is, you're thinking about contracting the property, that's going to be your table. And you're hoping, that as you're doing that, one, the seller's going to give you enough time. You're going to get a reasonable price from the seller where you don't feel like you're going to have to go back and retrade them later. Retraining meaning, hey, we found some things wrong with this site. We need you to cut your price, or we need you to give us more time. All of those things cost you money at the end of the day as a developer. But you're also, at that point in time, you're trying to set an expectation in your head of, and for the project, where are the market values today?
Yeah.
And where do I think they're going to be at the end of this project? And, that's kind of the reading the table part. And then you make the decision, okay, this is the table I want to sit at, right? I'm going on this piece of property. I'm contracting it up. We're starting feasibility. That's your buy-in, okay? That's your initial buy-in. You're spending tens of thousands of dollars to go through due diligence feasibilities on a lot of these properties for a lot of these projects. You're checking for the major red flags, man. You're going out and you're having somebody look to see if there's critical areas, right? So you're doing a critical areas reconnaissance check to the biologist. You're making sure you don't have any steep slopes or hazardous soils or, soils that could liquefy in the case of an earthquake. So you're sending out a geologist, you're dropping test pits into the site, and you're making sure the geology of the site works for what you're trying to do. You're evaluating utilities. How far away are they? How big are they? Do I have to build a regional lift station when I do this project, right? Can I get service? Do they even have capacity in their treatment plant? Are they under moratorium? All those questions have to be answered. Offsite improvements. What are my expectations for what I think offsite improvement is going to be? So you are somebody who's working for you as a consultant is plowing through capital facilities plans, transportation improvement plans. You're trying to understand what is the jurisdiction envisioned for this area and how is that going to bite me at the end of the day with costs. You're doing a traffic analysis. You're not doing traffic impact analysis yet, which is a bigger, broader study you do during the process, but you're doing a traffic impact analysis because what you're trying to do is understand like, all right, is there an intersection we know here is a problematic intersection and that's going to trip up the ability to develop because it's going to either require a really expensive improvement or the jurisdiction has to fix it, but they're not able to fix it yet because they don't have the money.
Yeah, it's not in their budget.
It's not in their budget yet. So that's your buy-in at the poker table.
And I want to add to that real quick. Everything is basically built by developers. And so when people don't understand, when all of a sudden that new townhome project goes in and that impacts that intersection, then the developer is the one paying for the brand new stoplight to replace the stop signs. And those stoplights right there start at 150 grand for one of the cheap ones and go up into the 200-300s per road.
Yeah.
So it gets astronomical quickly.
It does. And let me pause before we kind of go back to the analogy because I want to point something out that I think is important to point out because I don't think most people understand this out there. So a new development goes in, right? And they build a sidewalk in front of their development along the road. And the sidewalk stops at the edge of their property. And most people decry the developer. Oh, that developer, they're not providing walkways. Or they get mad at their elected officials. Oh, the city dropped the ball, man. Let the developer hoodwink them, or the developer's got the city in their pocket, or all those sorts of things. Let me just make my plea right now. Stop blaming the city and the developer for that. It's not the city and the developer's issue. It is a legal issue, which is there are two cases called Nolan and Dolan. And one says that there has to be a nexus between the exaction. So what an exaction being what you require somebody to do as a part of their project.
Yes.
For purposes of issuing a permit. So there has to be a nexus. Like, is what you're asking them to do related to that exaction? Basically, does their project cause you to need to ask for that?
Got it.
Let's call it that. The other one of those is called rough proportionality. And that is what you're asking them to do roughly proportional to the impact that their project has. At the end of the day, that's a very tough one to enforce relative to like offsite improvements, big offsite improvements. It's not going to pass those tests.
Yeah.
Now there's sometimes that it does, but for the most part, it's not going to pass that test. And in fact, the Supreme Court right now is looking at a case. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it is, again, it goes back to just the fees that you pay associated with trying to develop something, whether or not that nexus and rough proportionality interplay with that, and if they're legal exactions or not. And that could impact a lot of things in development going forward. But the point I wanted to make is some of the things you see, the assumption I hear in community meetings, neighborhood meetings, city council meetings, when I'm talking to people, because we go out and oftentimes meet with neighboring properties when we're getting ready to do development. I always hear that, man. It's the developers got the city in their pocket, or the developer's this evil, bad person that's not doing the stuff that they're supposed to be doing. There are limits to what a jurisdiction can require a developer to do. Number one, legal limits. And then the other piece of that you have to look at is if you're concerned about housing affordability, you want those limits enforced, because the more the developer has to do, the more expensive the homes that are getting produced will be.
Well said.
That's
well said.
Just simply put. So back to my analogy, the ante, okay? So you get down to it, and you got your buy-in, and you got a chance for people to go around the table and ante up before you get the flop. And that's really your process as the developer. You submit a pre-application to the jurisdiction, which is a quick and dirty kind of layout of a project, the assumptions that you're making for the project. And what you want is the jurisdiction to kind of, you want to lay that out there, and you want to, it's like watching your fellow poker players around the table. You want to see how the jurisdiction responds. What are their ticks? What are their movements? The whole bit. And that what you're going to get from them is a bunch of comments. And with their comments, they're going to give you every problem, at least at that point, based on the information you've submitted, every problem they see. So for example, you might have a project you think you're gonna get 25 homes. City believes that maybe you can't get 25 homes because there's this critical areas over here, and they're not really sure that you can justify, a buffer reduction in essence. And if you don't get the buffer reduction, you lose two lots, you're down to 23. And, to get a buffer reduction, you have all this criteria and code that your wetland biologist is going to have to go through the criteria and go through the analysis and provide the information to justify your ask. But at that point in time, you could lose 2 lots. That impacts the underwriting of the project and the pro forma and whether or not your project pencils. And so that's a big significant thing. At the end of the day, even if the pro forma works, losing 2 lots, it's going to impact what the other lots are worth, how much they're going to get sold for. So then they're going to tell you things like, here's your frontage improvement requirements. Well, what if they come back and you're not doing standard frontage improvements? They've got a plan for that roadway. And as a part of that plan, instead of your typical 6-foot wide sidewalk, they want you to do a 10-foot wide multi-purpose trail. Well, it's 4 extra feet. You got 1,000 feet of frontage. That's 4,000 square feet.
There goes a lot.
There's a lot. You just lost a lot. So now let's just say they winnowed you down at pre-app to 23, and now they just winnowed you down to 22. You're now 3 lots down. And then, we won't get in. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but let's just say like, instead of allowing you to do like 8-foot or 10-foot walls between units, which that's an issue of grading, right? A good colleague friend of mine always says, like, you make your money buying the dirt, you lose your money moving the dirt, right? So the more you want to try to balance a site, which is you want as little stuff to leave the site as possible, which is all the duff and the organics, and you want to have to bring in as little fill as possible. And so to do that with the terrains and undulations of sites, oftentimes that means terracing things and doing walls. Well, there's some jurisdictions that only allow for 4-foot walls. Well, and you have a 4-foot wall, and then you have to bump over 4 feet because you got to put a landscaping thing in, and then you got to go another 4 feet to get that 8-foot wall. Now, between every lot, you're losing 4 feet. Well, you get 10 lots going across. I mean, it adds up again. Next thing you know, you're losing a lot's worth of land. Yeah. And land is the most valuable input, or it's the most expensive input in this process. And so, that's now you've read the table, you've got the ante out on the table, you know what's before you. And now basically that time period and kind of leading up to what the flop is, you got to go back to your consultant team. You got to refine the site plan. You're going to have to adjust the layout, maybe. Evaluate changes to the design, to the infrastructure that you were anticipating. Maybe the jurisdiction doesn't want you to run the water line where you're going to run the water line.
Yep.
Now you got to run it a longer distance. Well, it's X number of dollars per linear foot to build water line. And now that just, got extended by 500 feet. That's a cost, right? And then you've got to do all the things you got to do to justify getting back to the density that you thought you had, right? Because your assumptions were based on 25 units. And if you're now going to get less than 25 units, there's a couple of things that have to change. Either you accept it because you feel like you still got enough other good going in your pro forma and the market's accelerating really fast and you think prices are going to make up the difference at the end of the day, or you got to go back to the land seller at that point and say, hey, Mr. Seller, we got a problem. Yeah. The seller goes, no, you have a problem. I don't have a problem because I'm telling you what I'm selling it for and I'm not budging, right? And we do see that a lot. And so really that the flop is, you're sharpening your pencil. You're looking at the cards that come down on the flop and you're sharpening your pencil, your pro forma, you're gauging where the market's at. You're trying to figure it all out. Then you go for the turn, right? You got your ante, you make your decision on your bet, your ante, whatever, but you go to the turn. So now, you got this, the turn is revised site plan. Everything's completed. You've done all of these studies, traffic, drainage, geotech, all of those things, hundreds of thousands of dollars into studies, easy 6 figures for studies. And you submit your preliminary plat to the jurisdiction. Now you wait and wait
some more.
Because on average, it is 8 to 16 weeks in most jurisdictions to get first round comments. And you will get first round comments. Nobody gets through without a comment, right? And most of the time, people have more than one round of comments. So if you think, let's just think about this for a second. If I got 16 weeks till first round review, And then it takes my team 4 weeks to turn that around. That's 20 weeks. We resubmit, and it takes the jurisdiction another 8 weeks to review second round. Now we're at 28 weeks. And they have a couple more comments that come back. Okay. And that takes me 3 weeks to turn around. I'm at 31 weeks. And I sent it back to the jurisdiction. It takes 4 more weeks to turn around the review of the comments. And now they decide you could go. I'm at 35 weeks out of a 52-week year is review. Now, that's carrying cost. That's interest you're paying on the money you have into this thing. There's cost that happen that you don't have any control over, right? That may be you got a 9-month contract, and after 9 months you had to waive feasibility, release your earnest money deposit to the land seller, and you got closing, X amount of time after that. And now you're running up at that point in time against, well, gosh, I either have to close without my entitlements or I have to go back to the land seller and ask for more time. And typically that means giving up more non-refundable money.
It's always money.
It always comes back to the dollars, right? That's the kind of complications you go through, right?
I want to add in one thing. So David just went through like the timeline once you're ready to go. And there's still a huge preparation timeline by getting all the surveys, getting all the consultants, getting all of the reports put together. So generally speaking, you're looking at, on a small project, 6 weeks, 8 weeks just to get ready. But on a big project like you're talking about, that's usually 90 days, 4 months to get ready. So you've got 4 months to get all of your paperwork ready before you submit it to the municipality. Then they take the 36 weeks to work through it. So we, really a lot of these timelines just to go from I put this under contract to where I'm now approved to do something physical on the property is around a year or more.
Yeah, it's at least 12 months. And typically it's more like 16 or 18. And you get to some really difficult jurisdictions to work with. I'm going to try not to name names today. I could. It'd be nice to shame some people every now and then. But you get to some other jurisdictions, it could be 24 months.
Yeah.
And that adds up.
Because
and then
that's
think
one
of
of
the
those
risk.
inputs.
Think of the risk.
Yes.
So think of where was the market at? And you'll know this way better than I am. Tell me where the market was at 18 months ago, Anton.
24 months ago, it was on fire. The Fed had not raised interest rates. Interest rates were still at historic lows, so the market was rapidly appreciating.
And did you have anybody that you were working around at that time that was like raising huge alarm bells that things were going to come to a grinding halt?
Nope, no one.
Right. So you would have made a decision 24 months ago to jump into a project like this.
Yes.
And then now, interest rates went wild and lenders clamped down. And you saw a couple of banks that, because of the deals that they had made, they got basically taken over. Landscape changes fast.
Yeah.
Right. And it changes a lot faster than the entitlement process. And so when you're the guy that's holding the bag on that as the developer, you really got to feel good about things. And you really, really have to feel like you have enough built into your pro forma to handle and manage that risk. Yeah. I don't know anybody that wouldn't want to be that way.
Well, I think the major point that you're bringing up goes to show our listeners why so many development projects got paused, why permits got paused, why we're headed towards even more of a housing shortage, both on the single family, multifamily side. So I'm talking rental and for sale in 2025 and 2026.
You look at it, we're between 100 and 150,000 housing units short in the state right now. And that's growing at between 10 and 15,000 a year. And that's based on current production. And there's nothing right now that leads me to believe that production is going to ramp up substantially. It might ramp up a little bit, but we're not there yet. And we'll talk about some of the legislation that passed. And I think people's assumptions about how fast things are going to turn are way different than what's really going to happen.
You're telling me that there might have been some political grandstanding here about I passed X bill and I'm proud of it, but the results aren't going to show up for months.
No, they're very aware of the fact that it's not going to show up right away. They know that. They know they understand the realities of that. But there is no fast way, right? That's the problem. There is no fast way. So just kind of going back to finish out the notion of the turn. So you get those comments back on first round of review.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, you need to change this. You need to address that. Hey, this isn't quite consistent with this code, or hey, you need to explain this because we don't think that in justifying your wetland buffer reduction, you've gone through the proper sequencing of showing avoidance and minimization and blah, blah, blah. So now it's on you and your team to defend your work. Back to the drawing board, you drop technical memorandums and redo plans and you submit it again. Meanwhile, as we just talked about, you're not in a vacuum. So the basis point on interest rates, it went up, interest rates went up 50 basis points. Demand has started to cool because, we're talking about, we made these decisions before we knew that those things were going to happen. Now you just found out that when you go back and you kind of reprice things for your pro forma, your stormwater costs are going to be 7% higher. Your asphalt costs are going to be 5% higher. Fuel prices have gone up at that period of time for diesel. And so now you've got this issue because, the fuel prices are going to cause your contractor to enforce their surcharges for, they build into their contract. Like if fuel gets over a certain price, we got to surcharge you for the difference. That affects a lot of things. And I don't think people realize. So surcharge on fuel, that's going to affect the dump trucks coming to and from the site moving stuff. It's going to affect all of the equipment on the site that's moving things, not just through the early development process, but the utilities work. And that is, all of those things could change in a period of time. So then the river. In my mind, the river is you resubmit your plan to the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
You're probably not done with that round. You probably got more rounds to come. So it's like, keep going. It's like Texas, instead of 7 cards in Texas Hold'em, it's like 9 cards or 10 cards. But you resubmit. And sometime, whether it's after you got those first round comments or when you're in the process of you've resubmitted and you're waiting for review, somewhere along the lines, these are the kinds of things that you're going to now find out. You're going to find out that the jurisdiction or the sewer district is going to increase their connection fees by $1,000 a unit. You're going to find out
times 23 units,
times 23 or 25 units.
Yep.
You're going to then find out that not only did they raise the connection charge by $1,000, they now have new standards by which they have to meet for Department of Ecology for the effluent that leaves their wastewater treatment plant. So they're going to have to do wastewater treatment plant upgrades. And so they're going to increase the cost that the folks that use the sewer already have to pay. So they're going to see their monthly charges increase. But then to really help address the cost of that, because your project is going to add to what needs to be treated, they're going to now have this separate wastewater treatment plant capacity fee of $3,500. So that's newly enacted. None of those fees vest. So those new fees come on board. You can't go, hey, I submitted my application, 15 weeks ago. Okay, awesome. That's the fee that you're going to pay though, because fees like that don't vest. Also, at the same time, the city increased their water connection charge by $1,600. School impact fees are increasing $3,500 a unit. Traffic fees, there's a proposal before the city council for the traffic fees to go up between $1,120 a month and $1,700 a month. And again, you're not vested to impact fees. And so at the end of the day, if you look at that, you look at your lot count and you look at just the minimum you might pay in those increases, that's a $268,000 difference that you're going to have to eat. That's the thing that people don't understand. It's like, hey, yeah, make the builder pay more, make this pay more. Well, you tell me, so, that's a little over $10,000 a unit, right? Yeah. I'm not a math whiz, but $10,000 a unit. So you put $10,000 into a mortgage calculator, call it 7% interest.
Yep.
And amortize that over 30 years.
$50, 55 every month.
Every month.
Additional
For
30 years.
But that $10,000, what are you paying at the end of the day over the life of you paying on that $10,000?
Almost 30 grand.
Almost 30 grand.
Yeah.
And so what you got to understand is as you're out there and you're asking for jurisdictions to do these things because the builder is going to pay it, it is a cost of making that housing come to life.
100%.
It's the same as the cost of the plastic that goes into the case that you just bought for your phone. It's an input cost. And so at the end of the day, your cost you're paying includes all of the input charges. It's basically saying, hey, we think that the best way to pay for these things is to find this way to add this to the cost of housing. And it's going to be like we're making the jurisdictions requiring the infrastructure to be paid by people's credit cards. And the credit card is a 30-year mortgage. I don't know any other way to explain it that could get people upset, because everybody gets upset about property taxes, right?
Yes.
You ask somebody, I'm paying too much in property taxes. I don't know if I want to vote for the school levy because my property taxes are already too high. They're asking for a transportation district, benefit district in my community because they want to add an additional property tax to pay for roads and sidewalks and stuff that they didn't build years ago because existing deficiencies can't be passed on to builders. They have to be borne by the rest of the community. And those existing deficiencies include the things that they didn't ask for back when nobody thought we were going to be this dense, because they set the urban growth boundaries based on 4 dwelling units to the acre.
In 1995.
In 1995, right? So now we got to go back and take care of all the things we didn't do in 1995 because we have the same boundary, but we changed what that boundary is going to hold. And so at the end of the day, I mean, if people are irate about taxes, people need to understand these things that go into the cost of the house to begin with, because they're paying for it. And that's a substantially different cost than what you're paying for in taxes. And so you should be as angry as that. And at the end of the day, when we go through and I talk about all these stages and kind of try to compare it to playing a game of poker, because the developer, the builder, those guys are gambling on this to work out at the end of the day. That's why we had 2008. It wasn't just people speculating on houses and buying things and extra rentals and everybody owning 6 houses and stuff like that. It's a lot of different things. But as a builder or developer, you're assuming a lot of risk.
Yep.
And let's say you get to this stage and you got that $268,000 extra that now is added to your costs. What do? Do you walk away? I mean, maybe you spent $500,000 or more to get to this point.
Yeah.
Do you walk away from that?
Probably not. The $268,000 may have been your profit.
Could have been. I'll tell you one thing. Back about, well, it was probably 2002, 2003. I'll name a name now.
Here we go.
It's been a long time. Nobody that was a part of this is there anymore, so I don't feel bad. And we were able to get it worked out. But the city of Monroe had a park impact fee of like $1,000 per house.
Yeah.
And I was at the Master Builders Association, Snohomish County director, kind of land use lobbyist guy, does the local work in Snohomish County. Get a call from a builder member. Hey, you wouldn't believe this, man. The city of Monroe is increasing park impact fees to $10,000 and something dollars a unit.
Oh, from 1,000.
From 1,000.
Wow.
And I think they were sitting on 30 or 40 units. That's a number, right?
Huge.
It's a huge number. That's a number that is in your pro forma. And again, I go back to the fact impact fees don't vest. So they asked for help. And you play this delicate game when you're in a membership association. Like, is this a member issue because it affects all members? Or is this a person's project issue? Because membership organizations get involved in member issues, not necessarily specific projects. And looking at it, it's like, well, it affects all members that want to build in Monroe, because anybody that comes in now is going to have a $10,000 impact fee. And it's going to have an impact on home prices. And so we started digging into this thing. Well, it was like the city wanted to build equestrian trails, and they wanted to build, even though they were talking with somebody about sharing pools, they wanted to build a whole pool, and they wanted this and that. And in there, I kid you not, in the impact fee calculation of a project that would be funded was the welcome to Monroe signage and all the landscape decorations, because that's a park improvement. And so, as the guy working on that on behalf of the industry, we had to go through, why is this proposal so high, and gradually start picking away at, well, wait a second, this thing you're talking about here, if you're wanting an equestrian trail system to be built in your community and it doesn't exist today, that can't be 100% funded by the impact fee. Why? It's an existing deficiency. It's something that doesn't exist that everybody that has a horse in the community would benefit from, not just new people that bring a horse to the community, right? So you got to lop a portion of that off to make it fair, to make it proportionate. What the heck does building a few more houses have to do with you wanting a nice entry into your community? That's not a new homes thing. That's a community wanting to have certain amenities thing. Is that really an impact fee related expenditure? So you go through and you pick all of these things out. We were able to get it reduced over time, and we were actually able to get the city to allow that project to go forward without having to pay the newer higher fee, because it literally would have sunk the project. And they were so far along. I mean, they were ready to start construction on homes. But that's one of those things where it's like, you're so pot committed.
Yeah.
Like you can't do anything but to march forward and hope for the best.
Yes.
And hope ain't a good plan. You know, it's
Hope
like,
is not a strategy.
hope's not a strategy. It's not a plan, and it's not usually going to give you a very good outcome. Right. So that's that's kind of the thing. And so, you know, I always say like, okay, great. Now you won the hand, right? You've gotten your preliminary plat approved.
Yep.
You got your construction plans approved, and now you can go out and actually start to build something. And at that point, you're 19 months into the process, let's say. 19 months, you know, like, so that's where you get to your 2 years. And it's basically like you won the hand, but somehow, even though there were a lot of chips at the center of the table, the amount of chips that actually came back to you were less than the chips that you put in to begin with, right? And you don't take those chips and go to the house and get like that amount. You take those chips now and you got to go out to the marketplace and you got to see what somebody's willing to give you for them.
Yes.
That's the risk in this, right? Because you're going back to the marketplace and it's about what the consumers are willing to pay. It's where interest rates are. There's all these different factors. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a tough business. And so anybody that thinks like, you know, hey, the market's going great, let me get into this development stuff, be careful. You know, I just was responding to a question earlier today where, you know, some folks were asking about some stuff. And I was like the biggest thing I could tell you is get damn good consultants to work for you. Get the best. Don't get this is one of those things where like you'd go, well, you know, I want to make sure this project pencils. So I'm going to go cheap. I'm going to hire the cheap consultants. Don't hire the cheap consultants.
We've made that mistake.
Right.
Yes.
You hire the consultants that have good track records,
Yes.
really great experience, and have a very evident portfolio of having gotten the job done
In a timely fashion.
in a timely fashion.
Who will communicate with you.
Yeah. Because, you know, I will tell you, like we've been brought in to fix issues before. I'll give you one example from up here in North Snohomish County in a jurisdiction. I get a frantic phone call from a guy that's trying to sell his project, and his buyer is the builder buyer is about to walk. He's the developer getting the entitlements. And he goes, I don't know what to do. I'm on my 7th round of review.
Oh my.
And from what I can understand from my engineer, the engineer is telling me, I have to go back and do a new wetlands study. And my wetlands study is based off of the previous stuff. Even though it would be vested, like his wetland study today was vested. It didn't need to change, but his engineer was telling him he needed to go get a new wetland study. And the concern is that the buffers could get bigger and what could be built would be less. And so he's like, I need somebody to look at this. I need a third party to look at this, render an opinion, and work it out. And what I explained to him is like, okay, this is how we handle these situations. Is builders always want to say it's the jurisdiction's fault.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about, there are a lot of cases where jurisdictions are at fault for these processes not working and things not going well and density getting slashed because they're pushing back hard on certain things relative to projects. But at the end of the day, honestly, it's not always the jurisdiction's fault. Sometimes it's the consultant's fault.
Yeah.
They haven't done a good job. And so what I told that client at the time was like, listen, this is one of these projects where we get to play homicide detective for, you know, an afternoon. Like I get to show up to the murder scene. I get to interview this witness, and I get to interview that witness, and I got to figure out what's going on here, right? I got to assess what's gone wrong. Why are we on 7th round review? Why is this not getting processed? Is the jurisdiction asking what your engineer says that they're asking for? And if so, why? How can we resolve that? We have to figure these things out, right? And we dug into it, took a little bit of time, but that was not what the city was asking the engineer for. What the city was asking the engineer for on what was 7th round review comments, which meant an 8th submittal, was we want you to take the existing conditions plan sheet and we want you to overlay that on top of the proposed site plan so we can superimpose the existing conditions and how the site plan relates to what's currently on the site. So it's like, I want sheet 2A and 2B to be combined. And so you now have a sheet 2C.
No problem. Not that big a deal.
That is not a problem.
Yeah.
They had asked for that at 3rd round review, and they have received submissions up through 7th round of the exact same thing. Now there were a couple other corrections. up through like 5th round. But at the end of the day, it was that thing was driving the fact that it was at 7th round review, and it cost that guy all that time, and he was at risk of losing the deal to sell it to the builder. Just stuff like that. And that's the kind of story I like to convey. Make sure you got really good consultants.
Yeah.
Because they're going to make or break whether you get your project at the end of the day and if it's profitable or not.
Yep. 100%. I want to switch gears and go real quick to this idea of what is the GMA. You kind of hit it a little bit in the beginning, but I want to explain to people here in the Seattle Metro Washington State, like, what is the Growth Management Act, aka the GMA?
Yeah. So Growth Management Act, as we talked about, early 90s, basically in 90 and 91, the legislature approved the Growth Management Act. It was kind of in 2 parts. Part 1 was in 90, part 2 was in 1991. And like I said earlier, jurisdictions were not necessarily always required by the state to plan, but most jurisdictions did comprehensive plans. They had something of that kind, right? That guided that and guided zoning. And so you get this mandate from the state, you shall plan. And back then,
it was like the commandments came down, you shall plan.
Yeah, there are 13 commandments, 13 goals of the Growth Management Act. And the 13 goals, like, you're going to develop a comprehensive plan. And here's the 13 things that it has to achieve. It has to reduce urban sprawl. It has to, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you go through all the 13 goals at the time. Well, now that's 15 goals, by the way. There was always an unwritten 14th goal dealing with shorelines of the state.
Yeah.
Because the shoreline requirements for the state of Washington were actually enacted before growth management happened. And so they kind of assumed that it was just there, and it was this unwritten 14th goal. Legislation later changed to call it out as the unwritten 14th goal. And then now with them adopting climate resiliency as a new goal for growth management, requiring climate planning, now you've got 15 goals because they've officially added shorelines and they've added climate. So the Growth Management Act, basically the jurisdiction has to go through the process of identifying what their urban areas are going to be, and what they kind of base that off of population. That's what the Growth Management Act. So you set a population target, and that's what you plan for, and then you base your urban areas and all of your planning inside has to have the capacity to support that number.
Does that account for businesses, homeowners, renters, or is it just units as a whole?
Well, it's getting better about getting into the finer details because the legislature is now asking for new things. Used to be you planned for population.
Bingo.
And now you have to plan for housing units. And more specifically, the state legislature has said you need to plan for housing units based on AMI. Which is annual median income. And so that's the new thing to jurisdictions. So there's some squawking amongst some jurisdictions about, well, wait a second, why do I have to take this share of 50% and below AMI? Like, we don't really want that stuff in our community.
Yeah.
It's like, well, because that's your responsibility. That's your obligation.
So let's dig into that because you went super technical. 50% and below of AMI. So you're talking a very affordable housing unit.
That's basically a subsidized housing unit.
A subsidized housing unit.
That's where you're kind of 50%, 30%. You're starting to get into subsidized territory.
Got it.
It's really hard for builders to build at that level. 80% AMI and above is probably where market can build. You've got some folks out there that are affordable builders, affordable housing builders. They can get lower. It's how they structure their deals and a bunch of different things. And they're not building for profit as much as your other for-profit builders do. Or they look at profit differently along the way. That's the other thing too. Like you look at a multifamily or industrial, and there's a difference between the guy who's building it to sell it to somebody else who's going to be the owner and the guy who's building it to own for his own portfolio.
Yes.
Right. Because return on investment in each of those cases is going to be different. So in the beginning, in 1995, counties that chose to plan under the Growth Management Act had to adopt these comprehensive plans that followed all the guidance of the Growth Management Act, and they had to establish urban growth boundaries. And the urban growth boundary or urban growth area is the area they knew at the time in 1995 that they felt was like, this is all the land we shall need to meet our population target. And
forever.
Well, no, they didn't even think that. Because that was not the assumption. In fact, I went back and my dad was a mayor at the time.
Got it. Okay.
My grandmother was actually on a planning commission in another jurisdiction at the time. And I went back, I asked him, not like that was when I was a kid. And then I grew up and I got into this business. So I went back and asked him, like, in one case, my dad, why didn't you like take the line here instead of where it's at today? Like, we're not talking a few 100 feet difference, but like that makes all the difference as far as the infrastructure that needs to get built in this area. My dad was like, he goes, I'll be honest with you as I can be, which is, we just never thought that would be needed.
We didn't think that many people would be moving into the Seattle metro over, that period of time.
And then the fact that the boundaries have never really substantively been adjusted. 34 years or 30, almost 30 years.
Yeah.
Now, basically. So
that goes back to what you had talked about originally. Hey, there was my house in Ohio versus the house in Lake Stevens. There was a $600,000 gap. Not all, but a portion of that $600,000 gap is created by forcing this density because it changes the value of the input, to use your words, in that area substantially.
So look at houses that were built in the 90s, right? 9,600 square foot lot size.
Yep.
Maybe 8,400 square feet if they were in like a planned residential development or a lot size averaging project. So 9,600, 8,400 square feet lot sizes, and your standard today is a 40 by 90, it's 3,600 square feet. Well, what's changed? Why are we building on such small lots? Oh, it's just the builder wants more profit. Well, the builder, it's like when you talk about other like manufacturing and things like that. To make products nowadays is more expensive. So to keep things relatively close to the same price, you have to change something about what you're making. Gosh, I was at Taco Time the other day. I vividly remember when I went to Taco Time, the tostada salad was like, 40% bigger than what it is today.
Yeah.
It's like a little tiny cup today. Prices are probably still higher than they were back then, but things have shrunk. Like, things change to try to keep prices relatively the same. And I would bet, I'm not an expert at this, but I would bet like your mini cans of soda today are probably what the 12 ounces were before. And they're giving you the option to buy the mini cans or the full size cans, right? It's a marketing thing to give you levels of affordability in cans. So like, things change. And so as growth management has changed, you look at the population forecast in 1995 for the 20-year planning horizon through, so 95 to 2005. So 2015, that period, things changed, right? We've grown. And in fact, just about every jurisdiction, this is the thing that upsets me. We do these buildable land studies. We look at how things are happening out there and everything like that. I challenge you to go to a buildable land study and find where they say that they're not meeting their targets. But then my question for you is tell me if they're meeting their target, and according to most buildable lands reports in the counties and the cities around here, not only are they meeting their target,
they're exceeding.
No, not necessarily. Well, some cases they might be a little over. Some jurisdictions might be just a little under. But for the most part, if you look at it on a countywide basis in a buildable lands report, they're like, we are like, boom. We're like on the line.
Got it. We're dead on.
We're dead on.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I just scratched my head. I'm like, okay, how can I reconcile this in my mind? Because I know we're 150,000-ish units short in the state.
Yeah.
I know that like probably 90,000 of that is just this 4-county region, King, Pierce, Kitsap, Snohomish. According to Piercetown Regional Council's housing needs study, it's like 90,000, something like that. How can we be so on the line in the growth monitoring report and the buildable land studies and stuff, but have a deficit? That would tell me that those studies, the buildable land studies, the growth monitoring reports, all that stuff that jurisdictions are doing, they're either playing around with the numbers to make them look good, to justify the growth plans that they have so they don't have to make the hard decisions, or we really don't have a shortage. I really, in good conscience,
it's that one.
I think it's the jurisdictional stuff, right?
One of the things I've always assumed that was happening there, and I'd love to get your take on this, is when they create those buildable land studies, they're making an assumption that a majority or all of the land inside would sell. But if you just think like a normal human for a half a second, try to get 10 people to agree to anything. You'll never get it to happen. But I could probably get 2 to agree, maybe 3. And so I think one of the major, flaws in those studies is they assume that such a large turnover is going to happen with the land inside, because they drive up the taxes and the value's gone up, so therefore they would sell. But they don't take into account the other part that, one, let's try to get 10 people to agree. 2, our massively aging population wants to age in place. They've lived there 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. They don't necessarily want to move, no matter how much money, because we've done this. For certain investor developer clients, I have offered what I consider to be ridiculously stupid amounts of money for pieces of land that I personally would never pay. And in good conscience, I actually told them not to make this offer because it was so high. And the person still says, no, I'm just going to live here. So it's not money that necessarily causes them to move.
Yeah, that's very true. We call that a market reduction factor is what it's accounted for in buildable land studies. Different jurisdictions use different market reduction factors. I would say they're probably not, they're a good assumption.
Yeah.
Are they accurate? I don't know. Again, the folks that do these things, the data scientists that build these buildable lands reports and study these things, they'll tell you that the analytics are great, and they're perfect. And I mean, I listen to Brock and Salk in the mornings a lot of times, and you hear them and even others on the channel talk about data analytics and how much of that pro football stuff is the pro football focused stuff is accurate versus like players will tell you it's not, because it's not what they're seeing in the game film, because the folks that are doing the analytics aren't guys that are playing the game and they don't know the play, they don't know this and that. And so that's the kind of thing that we're struggling with in my mind in buildable lands, right? The buildable lands guys know how to come up with a formula and assumptions. You know what they say about assumptions, right? Right? When you assume, you make up out of you and me, right? And so they create assumptions. And they're trying to create assumptions, and they're being very conservative in their assumptions. And the reason is because that is something that's challengeable to the Growth Hearings Board. They can get appealed for that.
Yes.
And quite frankly, I think more people should appeal it. What's happened in the past is people have appealed it and said, no, you're over planning for too much population. That's where they've gotten beat up. Early on in GMA, they got beat up on that. And so they made these very, very conservative assumptions. Here's my bigger issue with buildable lands reports. And I fought this last time around because we're in a periodic update right now to Snohomish County, King County, Kitsap, and Pierce. They're all doing their periodic updates. Snohomish County in particular, because I got a lot of vested interest here. I live here. I care about here. I've been working here for years. I went after this really hard this last time because you do your buildable lands analysis. Your buildable lands analysis is then followed up by getting your guidance from the state on what your population targets should be, and they give you a low number, a mid-range number, and a high number. And then you take those two things, because you figured out now, what's my capacity for supporting growth in the future? What's my population target? And then you figure out your decisions on, okay, what needs to change with my zoning assumptions? Do I need a UGA expansion? All these different kinds of things. And you get both a population and an employment target.
Yeah.
And stuff. I think the targeting has got some room for growth too. But at the end of the day, the thing that drives me nuts about the Buildable Lands report that shapes all of the assumptions that are made into the planning process, and we went through it. We put together this detailed thing about, okay, you're showing this property as having this much capacity. That property is just got construction plan approval. It's under development. Anton, what's the first thing that a builder does when their plat gets under development? They start putting in their initial improvements at the entryway.
They put up a sign.
And a sales trailer,
Yep.
and they start pre-selling
Yep.
units. Okay. So what I've said all along is that you can't count that as future capacity. And they're like, no. We count that as pending, and pending is still capacity because nobody lives there yet. And I'm like, no. The moment it is land that's under development, that needs to be removed from the equation.
Makes total sense. Yes.
What the planners say is, well, yeah, but we took the population and we equaled it out over here. And so they did this, like, I submitted all these things, and there was a whole meeting on this, and basically, I'm not a data scientist, so I was told I don't know what I'm doing with numbers, But how they explain, like they level it out and all this kind of stuff, is like, I don't know how anybody can good conscience could go, we're 150,000 units shy in the state. We're X number of thousands of units shy in the region. And we're going to say that somehow all these things level out because pending stuff that's under construction that people are out pre-selling should be counted as available capacity. It's like, no, in many cases, that population's here and they're living with somebody.
They exist. Yes.
They're here.
Yes.
And there's not a house for them yet. And they're waiting for the opportunity to open. And so that's where I think that this whole issue between the planning and then the reality of the shortfall and deficit that we have in housing supply, that's to me where the disconnect is. We're not counting the right things. We're not accounting for the actual land that really truly is available for future needs.
Yeah. Next, I want to go over these two bills that passed, the middle housing, the ADU bill. And I want to talk about, okay, what does this mean? So there was a lot of articles that came out in all of our newspapers, and it was everywhere, and everyone had an opinion. But I want David's opinion on middle housing and this ADU bill, and then also on when they can actually come to fruition and what it actually means.
For those that don't know, HB 1110, which is the middle housing bill, was approved last legislative session in 2023, signed into law by the governor, went into effect July 1st of last year. The goal of that legislation is to really force jurisdictions to create middle housing. And so what do I mean by middle housing? We have traditionally had single family zoning. In single family zones, you can build detached single family homes, period, in most cases. Some communities might let you build a duplex, but anything more than a duplex, and they make you build it on a lot that's 150% the size of your regular lot that's required as far as lot size go. But when you look at it, like they didn't allow other things. So what the legislation said is depending on the size of your jurisdiction and the availability of transit, you have to provide a certain additional mix of housing in these single family zones and achieve a certain minimum level of density allowed. And so essentially, you're now going to have in the future the potential in a single family zone to have up to a sixplex on a lot. So where you would only get one house before, you could potentially get 6 units in a sixplex. Communities vehemently opposed this in the legislature. They wanted nothing of this. They wanted to protect the integrity of the single family zone and how things have always been. Now there's a lot, there's many angles to this. One is the housing affordability angle. The other one is racially desperate impacts angle of this, which is by having these single family zones and not in, building multifamily and creating enough housing diversity in the marketplace to keep prices affordable. We've had impacts on, equity impacts on those that are more impoverished than others. We've had impacts on certain, there are a lot of things in Washington where you still go back. I'm sure you see this in title reports every now and then. You pull a title report, you're looking at the covenants for a project that was built in 1946, 1954, 1963, and they'll have stuff in there that is, basically, an attempt to kind of block these neighborhoods from being anything other than white.
Yeah.
In reality.
Unfortunately, yeah.
It's an unfortunate, where we've come, right? And in fact, I've had to work in situations where like some of the restrictions associated with that is you can build this type of house and only one house on this lot. And so then when we've had clients that have gone and tried to subdivide out that lot and build more than one unit or, try to build more than one unit on a lot in that case, then we run into interference from the jurisdictions like, well, we can't enforce private covenants, but you're likely to get sued by that neighborhood association if you do something other than what's in the covenants. And so we've been at this, standoff. So you've got those issues. So the legislature is trying to accomplish density. They're trying to accomplish housing affordability. They're trying to deal with some of these impacts, these other larger impacts. And then the other thing you got to think about is we're running out of land that's vacant. So now we're going to be really getting into the era of growth management that is redevelopment, which is we are going to start taking down neighborhoods built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and replacing them with neighborhoods built in the 2030s. And in doing so, that existing housing stock, which is the affordable housing stock, is going to displace people. Where do they go and find something that's comparably affordable? You can't move them all to Eastern Washington. And I mean, you look at prices in Spokane and stuff like right now, they're not any better than here.
Yeah.
And so this missing middle housing thing is we need more inventory. We need more affordable inventory. We need to start getting ahead of these other impacts that are going to happen in the market in coming years. So the legislature, just the sidebar in this, there's a guy by the name of Joe Tovar. If you don't know Joe's name, you're learning it now. Joe's a planner.
Yeah.
Joe was one of the folks that the legislature called upon to help draft growth management when it was created. They then called for him to help them along the way. Well, he did that. Then he was one of the first members of the Growth Management Hearings Board, which is the appellant first court of competent jurisdiction that you appeal these growth issues to. It's a three-panel group. He was one of the first Growth Hearings Board members. So he got to hear all of these first cases, and a lot of the precedents that are there in growth management were set by those early Growth Hearings Boards. He did that for a number of years. And then he was back out planning, and he helped the state in several instances, including now missing middle housing. He's been along the way to help guide the state through trying to make changes for the things that weren't accounted for at the beginning. And he talks about growth management being in phases. And one of the things they did was they did this blueprint to Washington's future. It was a report the legislature commissioned. They hired the Ruckelshaus Center at the University of Washington and some other folks to put this huge, massive report. Like, how's growth management worked? Where is it going? What's not working? One of the things they did was they did interviews, anonymous interviews with elected officials, builders, community members, went around the state. And feedback they got during that process. And if I say this, and I'll let you in on it. We've got a little podcast of our own over at Toyer Strategic called Permitted with Conditions. Joe Tovar, we recorded some episodes with him here recently where we go through his whole, it'll be the best 15-minute episodes that people will watch if they really want to learn about the techniques and the mechanics of the Growth Management Act and how it's changed. But it was interesting. One of the things they learned, and one of the things that was in that report is that there are a lot of jurisdictions that fail the pressure that the decisions that growth management was really asking them to make, to densify neighborhoods, to have multifamily apartments, all of those kinds of things, that those decisions are not obviously very politically palatable in many jurisdictions. Yes. And they felt like they were in a rock and a hard place. And it was kind of like looking to the legislature, like, legislature, if you do not step in here and mandate something upon us, we can't politically do this because our communities will crucify us.
Yeah, and we'll never get reelected.
That's what led to missing middle housing bill, was the start of this effort to adopt legislation that in essence says, jurisdictions, you can't make these tough decisions. The legislature is going to now mandate you make the tough decisions. And you can blame us all day long, but somebody has to make the decision.
Good for them. And so how does this start to roll out? So that's question one. Question two is, how can every single family lot become a sixplex lot? Like, what are the thresholds here?
Well, we're going to see that how it develops. I mean, some of that, there's a model ordinance that just came out. There's still some questions over, like, legislature put in there some things like, well, jurisdictions can take into account critical areas as to whether they allow what. We don't know mechanics to be kind of determined yet in my mind, especially, you can have a model ordinance that the state creates, but it's not the requirement the jurisdiction adopts the model ordinance. They've got some ability to take from that and put their own twist to it. The key date here is right now, Snohomish, Kitsap, Pierce, and King, those 4 counties, are in their periodic updates for their comprehensive plans. Those plans are mandated by the state to be completed by the end of this year. Will all those jurisdictions, the counties and the cities within them, hit their date by the end of the year to adopt their new plan? There's a lot that don't think Seattle is far enough along in the process to finish by the end of this year. Yep. And so they're supposed to finish by the end of this year. Once they finish their periodic update, they have 6 months to adopt middle housing. And so we just roughly call it, somewhere around June 30th of next year, 2025. Expect it. Middle housing will finally be on the books in jurisdiction. Now, some are speeding up; they're going faster, but that's a rough cut number.
Our investors and our hardcore listeners, I want you to hear what David just said, and I want to put a spin on it. So, if they're adopting this in, let's say, middle of 2025, for conversation's sake, your opportunity as the investor is to go find things in late 24, early 2025. Purchase them at single family lot prices and then wait for this new code to be adopted and then be able to build a duplex, fourplex, or triplex there. And then also realize
Let me add to that.
even once it is adopted, that it will always take the market time to catch up. Yes, add, please.
Yeah, because you said acquire that land at single family home prices and wait for the ordinance to go into effect.
Yes.
I want to put a different spin on that.
Please, love it.
Tie the property up, get your butt down to city council meetings and participate in the ordinance being created so you understand it. And those local little nuances that jurisdictions are going to deal with, filling in the gray areas of what comes in the model ordinance and what's in state law. You need to effectuate what happens in the gray areas so that at the end of the day, what gets done and what you can do with that site is common sense.
Kind of like the fee simple idea we talked about the other day.
Kind of like that. Yeah. It is one of those things where, as they say, like if you're not at the table, you're what's for dinner. And when it comes to this legislation and it's coming, when these planning periods are, it's very clear in statute, when the planning periods are, you need to participate. And I'll tell you, this is the thing that scares me the most. We are a county of almost 1 million people, Snohomish County. You want to know how many people showed up in person or online to testify for the county's periodic update at the Planning Commission?
10.
More than that, but less than 100.
Oh.
So you talk about, I don't know, round numbers, what are we, like 800,000-ish people in Snohomish County on our way to 1 million?
Yeah.
And 100 people are the ones that are out there really actively making comments. That's it.
Yeah.
That is it.
Another thing we need people to do, and even if you're not in the Seattle Metro, you need to get involved in the planning process in your area. You need to understand where it's going, because one thing I've also seen over the years, we won't have time to get into this today, I've seen changes in zoning also be a taking from property owners.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say this, we go back to the whole development isn't easy. If you're getting into the development business, the best education you could get is go to your planning commission meeting, go to your city council meetings, and follow these land use issues.
Yeah.
It's the best education you'll get because you're going to really see what the pitfalls and the hurdles and everything else are.
School me on the ADU bill.
Okay, so just let me mention both the middle housing bill and the ADU bill, which is HB 1337. Unprecedented thing the legislature did with these housing bills. Now, I've never seen it before. I'm sure they've done it in other areas, but they've never done it with growth management housing. Because they basically said if you don't adopt to the new standards within 6 months of your periodic update, like the legislature has now told you have to, then your local laws are superseded by state law.
Oh, so just
automatic.
We're taking over.
Yep.
Wow. I actually didn't realize that.
How that actually gets done is not clear. Okay. Because it's not like they said, well, all your lots that have this, because there's obviously these factors of how do you actually administer it. And, but that was a pretty strong statement from the legislature going, we are not only going to command you to do this, there is a level of accountability here that if you don't, we will.
I love it.
Attached dwelling units. Basically, jurisdictions have been kind of on the fence about accessory dwelling units and whether they can be attached or detached. The bill says that a city or county must allow at least 2 dwelling units or accessory dwelling units on each lot in a residential zoning district within an urban growth boundary, provided that the lot in question meets the minimum size requirements by the zone, and the jurisdiction can't require the size of the home that gets built to have a floor area less than 1,000 feet. So some of this could be you have your house and then you put like a mother-in-law attached ADU on it, and then you put a separate detached unit on it. But you can now put 2 units. Now there's some caveats there for some things like critical areas. There's the big caveat that neither the state legislation nor local code has really effectively dealt with yet is impervious surface limitations and stormwater.
Yep.
And I think we're going to see the legislature probably have to go back and investigate that a little bit more and maybe add some direction in state law. But the other thing the city or county can't do is they cannot, because this is what a jurisdiction would typically do, is they'd have this new legislation says you do ADUs and the jurisdiction doesn't want ADUs. So what they do is they'd adopt setbacks and some other things that would chip away at your ability to actually make them happen.
Yes.
Well, they now have a specific statement in that legislation that setback requirements, yard coverage limits, tree retention mandates, restriction on entry door locations, design review, all those things cannot be more restrictive for the ADUs than what they are for the principal single family dwelling unit on that site.
So both of these are on a certain level a win for housing in Washington.
Big time. It's a titanic shift
Yeah.
in my mind. And now, the legislature's not done. We've got multiple bills this year where the legislature is taking a crack at it a second time, saying, maybe we didn't go far enough last year. Maybe we need to slap some more things down.
And so I want to do that on another episode with you. We talk about the future. If people needed, land use consulting, business consulting, economic consulting, how do they get a hold of you? What's the easiest way?
ToyerStrategic.com's got our contact information.
Yep.
The other thing somebody could do if they're just kind of looking to learn a little bit more, but they don't really, they're not ready to call yet, so to speak. We have a permitted with conditions site. You can link to it as it's our blog on our website. You click blog on our website, it takes you to it. Or you can just type in permitted with conditions and it's on Substack. And that's the kind of medium we use to send newsletters out. And other kind of content. We've got a podcast stuff we're doing.
Love it.
Video podcasting like you, and some other traditional podcasting where you don't have to look at my face that's made for radio, because it's certainly not made for TV.
And then we will link in the comments below both David's website and where you can subscribe to his newsletter and catch his podcast. If it wasn't clear, David is one of our consultants. He helps us with so many things. No joke, quick story, and I'll close with this. I'm doing a townhouse project. I am not getting the density incentive. I call up Mr. Toyer. Him and I talked through it. He said exactly what he said to the other gentleman. Hey, let me go perform an autopsy. He goes, performs the autopsy, and says, I believe we can fix this and get this extra density. We were able, through his services, to obtain 3 extra units on that townhome project, and that took that project from being a good project to a freaking phenomenal project. So we appreciate all your help, sir.
Absolutely.